In addition to the milestone publications that we noted in our seminar event, Professor Mbembe is a regular commentator on current events and cultural politics in South Africa and on the continent, and has for more than a decade been at the cutting edge of thinking in and of Africa in both Francophone and Anglophone academies. His most recent book forthcoming this year is Critique de la Raison Negra, and excuse my pronunciation, I'm not moving adequately across the two language groups. Our second speaker is Professor Anthony Bogues, Director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University, where he is Professor of Social Sciences, Critical Theory, and Africana Studies. He's currently a visiting Mellon Scholar at the Center for African Studies at UCT, and so we thank them for sharing him with us. And in addition to being author of the wide and influential range of works listed in the notice we circulated, Professor Bogues has co-curated the largest exhibition on Haitian art in Rhode Island, in the United States since 1978, and the recent Ships of Bondage exhibition, which was held in Rhode Island. And very excitingly, this exhibition will be traveling to Cape Town and opening at the Slave Lodge Museum on the 3rd of December this year, so do look out for that. Currently, Professor Bogues is working on two major book studies titled, respectively, From Revolution in the Tropics to Imagined Landscapes, The Art of Edouard Duval-Carré, and What About the Human? Freedom or Human Emancipation. Both Professors Bogues and Mbembe are very well known to most of us for their pertinent, profound and provocative interventions in studies of Africa, the diaspora and the post-colony. We're really delighted to be bringing them into conversation in a seminar format that's aimed at eliciting dialogue between them, as well as opening into an extended discussion with the audience. So we're following a somewhat different format this week. Each speaker will speak for approximately 10 minutes. They will then ask one another questions for another 10 to 20 minutes, and then I'll open to the floor for comments, questions, interventions on the topic of Africa Theorises. And finally, before we start, a thank you to Zeta from Humor for filming this and helping us keep a record. So thanks very much. Over to Achille.
Okay, first of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Meg and the department for the very gracious invitation. I'm also extremely delighted to have this opportunity to be in conversation with Tony. Tony is someone I have been following from some distance for a very long time. I find a lot to learn from what he has written, which is extensive, and what his experience has been. One of a man who has not stopped moving from one place to another, and in the process producing work that speaks a lot to a lot of us. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to listen to him. As we agreed that we would just put on the table a few points and then take it from there. And I would like to put on the table, let's say, three points. The first has to do with what seems to me to be a redrawing of the global intellectual map. A redrawing of the global intellectual map, which I would say started very long ago with, of course, many different phases, but underwent a kind of acceleration during the era of decolonization. A moment when, at least for those of us living and working in Africa, a moment when it became very clear to a lot of us that in order to account for ourselves in the world, we needed to invent not only new institutions, but also new paradigms. Some of you may remember the emergence then in the 60s of major historiographical schools, for instance in Dar es Salaam, in Ibadan, and in many other universities, with a very strong contribution from intellectuals from the African diaspora, Walter Rodney and a number of others, all of which led to what I would consider to be a very important moment when indeed from Africa we were able to produce a kind of knowledge that spoke beyond the continent itself. Witness, for instance, the contribution of the likes of Samir Amin in the whole development of the concept of the world economy, which was then taken up by Wallerstein, Fernand Braudel, the major French historian, and so forth and so on. So it seems to me that we underwent in the early 80s, 90s, a moment of dispersion, which was caused by various factors: economic crisis, authoritarianism of a number of governments, which led then to the migration of a number of intellectuals abroad, to the point where, in fact, the mass of African brains is today located outside of the continent. It is located outside of the continent through successive migrations, and find them in America, you find them in Europe, you find them in Asia, more and more, where they are contributing to the life of our disciplines, and to a certain extent to the life of theory as such. So you have that. You still have, of course, the old hierarchies between the North and the South, but it seems to me that more and more we see emerging alternative circuits of circulation, South-South, North-East, South-East. All of this has emerged during the last quarter of the 20th century. And it's being consolidated, to which one has to add, I would say, 2 or 3 things. One, the worldwide dissemination of thought. The fact that thought, in the best sense of the term, today is no longer provincial. It has been deprovincialized. The fact that a number of concepts have been denationalized, they are being reappropriated and reinvented. In any case, most of the great academic debates are no longer national, they are denationalized. Now the question, of course, is whether the denationalization of the humanities and of great academic discussions has brought a truly global perspective to conventional Western theory and criticism. That is something that remains to be seen. But in any case, the possibility is there, maybe more than at any other period of our history, for some kind of authentic global perspective on the world in which we live in, where the world becomes not only our home, but the world is also taken as a method. So the world as home and as a method, it seems to me that that possibility very distinctly is there, that the world can be studied from anywhere and everywhere, from Africa as well as from China. And it seems to me, without falling into some kind of naive cosmopolitanism, it seems to me that there is an opportunity there for the study of Africa, for discourse on Africa, an opportunity that didn't exist before. So I would be very happy to see, let's say, to hear Tony comment on this, since in fact he himself has been very embedded in these new cultures of circulation we are talking about. The second point I would like to raise, of course, has to do, since the title of our talk is Theorizing Africa, a set of comments on theory as such, especially on the state of theory today. Of course, I mean, theory covers a wide variety of practices. I would mention three, from methods to question the truth of authority, which it has been. I mean, that has been the meaning of theory right from the beginning, at least in the Western canon. Methods to question the truth of authority. Theory has also been understood, second definition, as a set of techniques to reveal the figures of power that operate in dominant discourses, institutions, or social processes, tracking them and revealing them. Theory has also had to do, and third definition, with investigating the limits of human reason and judgment. Now, if we take theory as that which encompasses those three definitions, and I'm sure that there are many others, but I chose to limit myself to these three, it seems to me that what we are witnessing today worldwide is somewhat of a flight from theory. I would say during the first years of the 21st century, what we have witnessed is a flight from theory and a re-embrace of empiricism, and in some sense born-again realism. All of this has gone hand in hand with a return to the ethical and the theological. So you have these two processes going hand in hand. A return to realism on the one hand, and a huge preoccupation with ethical questions and theological political questions. To this I would add also the growth of versions of popular science that have produced a ready public for arguments that seek to reduce human nature to biology. So the flight from theory has left a vacuum in which sociobiology, genetic reductionism, neurosciences, and cognitive sciences have flourished. This is particularly the case in the USA. In South Africa, of course, we would have to make a different kind of assessment, or for that matter in parts of Europe, have in mind what's going on in France. But it's very clear that these disciplines, neurosciences, sociobiology, cognitive sciences, they have somewhat annexed core humanities questions of intentionality, questions of agency, even questions of memory, sexuality, cognition, language, and so forth and so on. They have annexed them and push forward a theory of history, history understood as essence, and not at all history as openness to contingency. And it seems to me that when we look at what's going on, especially in the global south, in Africa, historically as well as now, of course, it becomes quite difficult to subscribe to a theory of history as essence. And that in fact, a huge part of our historical experience tells us that we have operated on the basis of a theory of history as openness to contingency. So, look, these are very difficult questions. I'm thinking telegraphically. We could imagine three types of theories of history. History as essence. Your future is predetermined by your genes, basically, or by your culture or your race. History as an attempt to domesticate contingency, which has been, in fact, the purpose of the whole modern project. I'm talking about history as openness to contingency, as something somewhat different from the two versions I have talked about. Anyway, we can come back to that later on. So where is theory today? I think in the West, the USA, parts of the USA, of course, you have all kinds of debates about the state of theory. Huge melancholia, nostalgia for the big developments that had been pushed forward before time when the crisis, questions of representation became so dramatic. You have those like Latour or even Mary Poovey who believe that, in fact, we should, the humanities should open up much more than they have done to hardcore sciences, the aim being to reestablish the validity of facts in an age when, of course, because of the revolution in images, the difference between fact and fiction seems to have collapsed, or in any case has been blurred almost irremediably. All these debates are out there, and the fate of theory is, I would say, hanging in the air. It's hanging up in the air at a time when the Western archive, which has dominated much of our understanding of ourselves for a very, very long time, is that hegemony, the hegemony of the Western archive, is coming, I would say, to an end. I was talking to Tony a moment ago. He's more measured than I am, and he was saying the Western archive has been challenged. I would go a bit further than that and argue that it is running dry. It is running dry at a time when the immensity of the problems the world is facing, from the crisis of the climate change to the new wars of occupation, predation, the antagonism we are witnessing between, on the one hand, democracy, and on the other hand, the forces of the market, the emergence of a class of people who are totally superfluous, meaning that capitalism doesn't need them as a reserve labor army. They would disappear tomorrow. It wouldn't mean much to the operations of a world financial system that is now not only producing itself, but becoming more and more abstract. When those questions have reached a level of acuity probably hardly ever seen before. And the biggest laboratory of all these contradictions is the Global South. The Global South has become that laboratory where we can begin to witness what is to come. What is to come, including in the West itself. So the fact that that Western archive has run dry, it seems to me opens up a moment of opportunity, but also of danger, both going together, for critical thought. And therefore, we have to think seriously about how it is that we reanimate, let's say, the theoretical enterprise in order to be able to not only to account for what's going on, but also to intervene in it in a way that reopens, let's say, the possibility of life for many more people than has been the case for the time being. So for me, the question of theorizing Africa has to be understood from within this larger perspective in which we consider the world not only as our home, but also the world becomes a method, and I would say a pedagogy, and of course a politics and an aesthetics. And I didn't talk about the aesthetic part, but I'm sure that Tony, who is very much versed into this, can help us to unearth it.
Thanks very much, Achille. Let me begin by thanking Sandy for asking me to do this, I think sometime in February this year when she was at Brown University. And then let me also thank Meg for following up with a whole set of emails so that we could get this conversation going. And also thank the English department for that we now need in the 21st century to think more, in my view, about freedom than emancipation, which means thinking in a much more open-ended way about the possibilities of freedom. What can that freedom look like? What is it in its plurality? And that you don't therefore have a kind of ideal in a kind of political, philosophical way that freedom is, and so on. But that freedom really is about a set of practices. And what those practices and how you delineate and work through those practices become, in my view, extremely important. The second point, as I said, has to do with the second statement, is about this question of the human. And this question of the human is really, in my view, perhaps one of the most important questions on the table today. Chile talked about this, a certain kind of history of essence, a way in which science, in my view, begins to take over, begins to evacuate any kind of agency at all, and that you are, you're genetically or racially constructed and so on, or culturally constructed. And that's the end of that, and therefore there's no particular set of possibilities. And science, therefore, certain kind of scientism, certain kind, because I'm not anti-science, please, certain kind of scientism then argues that there is a way in which it can answer every single question. And therefore the human being is really, the guy who won the Nobel Prize recently, says the human being is in the CD. When you can reduce the human being into a particular CD that you will have of genes, right? And then the guy who invented the DNA, what then you are saying is that there is simply no possibility for the human being to change. The history has stopped. And therefore there is a way in which therefore scientism is ahistorical. And once you are ahistorical, in my view, what you have done is that you have stopped human life on the planet. Because if there's anything about human life on the planet, it is that it is historical. We are human beings that keep on making. And it is that process of making that if one wishes that one can think about this question of this is of history. And therefore that's why it is open-ended, I think. But I think the question of the human then is also important. And it becomes a political question. Because I would want to argue that there is a way in which the market and neoliberalism operates in this particular conjuncture. And when I say conjuncture, I want to draw from Stuart Hall's notion of conjuncture as a kind of articulation of set of conditions. That in this particular conjuncture, neoliberalism operates as a way in which it wants to capture desire and imagination. And that the heart of the neoliberalism project, the heart of the project of market fundamentalism, is actually the construction of a different human species. That's the heart of the project. It is yes abstract, it is yes about inequalities, all those things that we know and we see. But I would want to argue that the time we are in the history of the human species, that the drive of the bourgeoisie, to use Marx's old phrase, is really about the construction of a different kind of human species. And therefore what becomes important on the table is what kind of human beings we are. And if in terms of thinking through that, therefore, it would seem to me that the thought and practices that have come out of Africa and the African diaspora, that has posed that question, that has posed what I am now calling a mode of being human, not just modes of production, but a mode of being human, is really one of the central things that we need to think about. Because neoliberalism essentially seeks to saturate the self. To saturate the self by controlling desire and imagination. Now, all hegemonies we know, Gramsci told us long ago, all hegemonies we know are always contested. So this is not a successful project. But what is interesting, I think, for neoliberalism is that the project of neoliberalism is really a project for totality. And if it is a project for totality, it is a certain kind, it wants to have a certain kind of actual control. In such a context, in my view, which is why I say the African Theorising project becomes a radical project in my view, not just an academic project. In such a context, in my view, the question of freedom becomes central. Freedom, what it is. What is freedom? Secondly, what kind of human beings are we, or what kind of human beings can we become? It would therefore seem to me that to think about African theorizing today and African diaspora theorizing is really to think about human freedom, and is really to think about this question of what is the human being, and not in any universal kind of sense, but to put on the table a set of questions that I think are very important for all of us if we want to have a more human planet.
Thank you. Give you an opportunity to ask questions of one another, and then we can open the floor, or would you like to move into drawing from the audience at this point?
No, first of all, I have to say that, Tony, I'm very grateful for what you have just told us, which opens up a huge array of questions. I would just like to comment on two comments. I think that what you just told us makes it even more urgent to try to rediscover the depth of the archive we are working with. Part of the drama of studying Africa it has been for a long time the kind of shortening of the archive that is part of the disciplines we inhabit. So the discovery of the depth of the African archive becomes a very important question. The depth of the written archive, because what has been written is a lot has been kept in writing. I was attending a talk yesterday at WITS by an historian working on Madagascar, where in the 19th century the Kingdom of Madagascar moved to, let's say, adopted Western forms of writing and constituted an archive, the historian was telling us, as well, equivalent to anything else that has been done at that specific period of history elsewhere. So we haven't really explored yet, or even less so mined, the richness of the archive. The archive before modernity, let's call it like that. And then, of course, there is all that has to do with the moment when we start, former slaves or slaves in America start writing themselves about who they are, what brought them here, why are they living under the conditions in which they are, let's say late 17th, early 18th century, in the United States of America, but also in the Caribbean, and then gradually in other parts of the continent, and the creation of this vast space of circulation, to limit myself to the Atlantic, space of exchanges between the US, Europe, and the rest of the continent, and the emergence of a very important body of thought, which deals precisely with the questions Tony was talking about. Who are we? Why are we here? What brought us here? How do we get out of here? It's the question of freedom and emancipation. Tony made a distinction between these two concepts, and I think that if one is to take seriously the African and diasporic experience, indeed there is a distinction that needs to be made. But at the same time, there are connections between these two terms, in the sense that both, I would say, appeal to two things. They appeal to a process of becoming. That freedom is always a part of a process of becoming, a process that is both individual and collective. That in fact it's impossible to imagine what freedom is if we do not think of it as an inner process, starting with the reconstitution of almost everything. Reconstitution of the body, reconstitution of interior life, but also as a collective project, in the sense that my freedom is meaningless in the absence of the freedom of those who are like me. So that question of becoming, and something that seems to me absolutely central, that has to do with the concept of the event. An event that is itself is to come. Call it hope, anticipation, whatever you want, but the fundamental belief that, the existing order is not that what is. That some other order is possible. And that it is the task of us as a community, individuals, to bring it about and to anticipate it. The importance, I have been reading of late in a lot of things on African American thought, the importance of the idea of the Jubilee, for instance. And all that has to do with performative practices, most of which are of course, part of a tradition, a critical tradition of how one does critique. But critique is always tied to some event that is to come. So it seems to me that in the age we live in, which is an age of cynicism, and keeping on to that idea that there is always something in excess of who we are and the conditions under which we live in. And mobilizing that space of the gap in order to articulate a set of practices, the aim of which is to create a different reality. It seems to me that holding on to that is probably the first step if we want to imagine something different. So all of that to say that I agree with Tony, and I'm quite amazed at the convergence that I see here. All of that having been said, the problem remains: what is it that we do with this Western archive that has been with us, and that has somewhat also become part of us, because it's almost impossible at this for some of us today to imagine ourselves without it. What does it cost to let it go? And is there a way of reanimating it in such a way that it doesn't tell any longer a history, as Fireman says, that is partial and linear. Are there internal possibilities in that very Western archive that would put it in the service of something totally different from the original hegemonic game? I have to say that when I say that the Western archive is running dry, this doesn't mean at all that it has to be discarded entirely. It doesn't mean neither, at least for me, that it has ceased to be powerful and nocif, to have effects that are negative. Doesn't mean that at all. It means, on the one hand, that it's not the only one that has historically existed. It means that we have to keep playing on its internal fractures and frictions, playing on to those internal fractures and frictions in order to open up a space in which we can genuinely co-share the world we live in.
Let me very quickly say some things. Response to the question of caricaturing of the new, what some people call the new sciences. I would say that there is a way in which the new sciences themselves are not homogeneous. That there are obviously those persons who are involved in things like particle physics and complexity theory that think about these questions and the role of contingency in this. Not so much the question of nature versus nature, which is an old question, but the question of actual contingency. Therefore, to me, what needs to happen is that, quite frankly, those of us in the humanities and humanistic social sciences need to begin to have a set of conversations with those scientists about the question of what the human is. Right? There's a talk I gave last year, which talks about the necessary set of openings that needed to happen between those of us who are in the humanities and humanistic social sciences and those kind of sciences. Because there's another way in which another group of scientists, the one who says the CD is the humanism in the CD, it really talks about biological determinism. And therefore, if you notice in my language, I talked about a certain kind of scientism. And a certain kind of scientism is a scientism that does not give any kind of understanding or any nod, if you wish, to questions of contingency and questions of the interplay of force of various social forces. But everything is a certain kind of biologically determined, and a certain kind of determinism that is really 19th century, and that's still and that has been carried over to the work of so-called science in the 21st century. And there are a whole host of people who, people who particularly Wilson, the biologists, and so on and so forth. We can list those persons. So I wanted to say that. Agree that there is a way in which one should not caricature, that the development of science and technology is absolutely important. Cognitive anthropology and so on, very, very important, but that at the same time there has to be a set of discussions that are open between those of us who are in humanities and humanistic social sciences. My second response quickly is about the new man. I am not talking about the new man. I'm not talking about Ches Newman at all, or even Fanon's new man. What I'm in the wretched of the earth. What I'm trying to signal is that there is a question about what the human is and what the human can become, which has to be open-ended, and that is on the table. That's what I'm trying to signal. What will happen is, to me, it becomes a set of practices, and this is why I think about freedom as a set of practices. What it will happen is a set of practices. What will happen is that we who are involved and engaged will determine it. But there is no final kind of new man to emerge. There's no telos, and then, okay, this is it. Let's go, we can all now go and party and have a good time. No. That they are, the phrase that I like is actually to describe this project is a phrase that Fanon uses in Black Skin, White Mask, right? How do we bring invention into existence? Right? And if you bring invention into existence, then to me what you are always doing is endlessly creating, and we can creating ourselves on this planet. The danger is that we are in fact we might implode before we get to that particular stage through ecological disasters, etc., and so on. Or we may live in a certain kind of what CLR call a certain kind of barbarism if we don't implode, if we don't implode. And obviously, yes, the business of the internet and so on is very important, because those technological practices are shifting who we are as well, are shifting a set of social relations that we need to think about, shifting in my view the nature of sociality. It really is. I mean, I have 2 kids, 2 daughters. I watch what they do. What the internet and the role that the internet plays in their life and so on is fundamentally different from mine. It's fundamentally different from a certain other generation, and they are creating a different kind of world. What it means, I don't think none of us quite understand and know yet, and therefore, in my view, we need to think through those things very, very carefully when we ask this question about what the human is and what we look like and what we want to become. To me, this question of the technological advances from neuroscience to the internet to Facebook to whatever and so on become really, really very critical. Let me just say very quickly, I agree. The Western Archive is running dry, but the question for me when I say the Western Archive is exhausted, it has been exhausted. What I mean is that fundamental questions that the West posed are not the ones that need to be posed today. That's the point I'm trying. That's the one I'm trying. And that it is very difficult for the West, in fact, to pose those questions, right? Unless it does a sort of reframing of itself. That's what I mean. I don't mean it has no particular purpose. For me, the questions of archive and the question of intellectual tradition is always about questions. It's always about issues. And the ways in which I think the Westerns pose a set of questions, it's very difficult to see that these are the very same questions of today. So that, for example, the question the West posed about liberty, in the, at the moment when the West was becoming the dominant, well, if you read everybody, the question was about a certain kind of liberties, a certain kind of freedom, certain kind of politics. All you have to do is just to pose, for example, the ways in which those who were making the American Revolution and fighting the British said, we do not want to be slaves. But these were the same slave owners who were saying to the British, we don't want to be slaves. So therefore, what did the word slave mean? What did that mean by freedom? The liberty that they were talking about was a certain kind of political liberty. Now, I am not arguing that questions of political liberty are not important. That's not my point. My point is that when the slave was then arguing with the people in Massachusetts and doing a different petition, in the same year, Prince Hall and them, that they were arguing for a different kind of freedom. That's all I'm arguing. And that therefore there is a way in which this business of the archive having to pose a certain set of questions, Foucault made it very clear, certain conditions that emerges that then makes you pose a certain set of questions on discourse. Then there's another set of questions on discourse, perhaps sometimes using the very same language, but that might mean something else. And you are right, obviously. That's what we do in the academy. We train, we teach people the Western Archive and so on. And I think, if you ask me, I think it's a problem. I think that the Western Archive should be taught alongside other archives, quite frankly. But I think some universities find that difficult because there's a question of ranking, there's a question of status, there's a question of authority, and all those kind of things which we frankly have to talk about, of who will get fellowships and so on. And we have a situation, you're right. I sat in meetings, on committees with people come and said, somebody will say, well, he hasn't quoted A, B, C, D, F, G. It's nothing about the paper. Who has he cited? What are the authorities? Who doesn't she cite? And that, in my view, is also a certain kind of way of thinking about knowledge practice, which is quite frankly flawed, because it becomes a certain kind of repetition apprenticeship, right? It doesn't teach people to think critically at all. You have to have, in my view, if you're in the academy, one of the key things is you have to be willing to be challenged. You have to have critical thinking. You have to have people to quarrel, what I call quarrels without fisticuffs, right? That's what, that's a place you can have it. You can't, and so therefore you need to have those things, so that those of us who are scholars and intellectuals need to think about what are the ways in which we then need to construct this other archive, and how do we teach both, right? What I'm trying to say is that the archive of thinking through Africa as a radical project actually puts questions on the table. How we answer those questions is our task.
Thank you very much. We've gone quite substantially over time.